A new trove of over 2,500 documents from US President Jimmy Carter's administration details Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, arms control, and the Iran hostage crisis. In early July 1979, President Carter authorized a $500 million covert action program to overthrow Afghanistan's socialist government. CIA named this Operation Cyclone. This was earmarked to train and arm Islamic fundamentalist, christened Mujahideen. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and democratic US new friend, Communist China, joined the effort to spread Islamic fundamentalism in Soviet Central Asia and dismember the Soviet Union. The somber events of Afghanistan that we see today perhaps began in July 1973. Witnessing the cynical Anglo-French games at the League, where they covertly encouraged Nazi Germany to wage war against Soviet Russia, Zahir Shah declared his country's neutrality during World War II. Thus, Kabul became an espionage paradise where combatants met and spied on each other. The Soviet embassy at Kabul was the center of crucial information gathering. Zahir Shah assisted Subhas Chandra Bose's journey to Singapore in 1940, where the latter raised the Azad Hind Fauj. Thus, Afghanistan remained safe from the violence that raged in 5 continents. When Soviet Union emerged as a nuclear superpower after World War II, King Zahir Shah became a close ally of that state. The informal alliance was beneficial to Afghanistan. This king had inherited his uncle's dreams of a modern Afghanistan. He introduced a new constitution in 1964, whereby elected representatives would form the Loyar Jirga or Grand Assembly. Wanting to reform Afghanistan's medieval laws, the king declared that the laws passed by parliament would supersede Sharia law. Once more fearing curtailment of their prerogatives, the Muslim clerics opposed this. They would oppose secularism many times. When the United States refused economic assistance to Afghanistan to please its ally, Pakistan, Afghanistan turned to the Soviet Union, who readily offered aid for the Helmand Valley Project, a $25 million arms deal, and an economic aid package worth $550 million. Roads were built between Kabul, Herat, and Kandahar that outflanked the Hindu Kush, constructed tunnels through gaunt hills, built grain silos for stocking food grains, and invested in small-scale industries. Aeroflot planes and Afghanistan's modernized Ariana Airlines regularly flew between Kabul and Moscow. Defense personnel were trained in Russia. 40% of Afghan exports went to Russia, including the famed Karakul fur. Young Afghan men and women received medical and technical education in Soviet universities. Russia invested in Afghanistan, who remained a friend on the frontier of Soviet Central Asia. However, economic progress slowed down when drought and famine adversely affected the country in 1971-72. Afflicted by eye problems, the king went to Italy for surgery. Events now began to take a tragic turn. On July 17, 1973, BBC Radio announced that while King Zahir Shah was abroad, his cousin Prince Daud Khan deposed the king and declared Afghanistan a republic. As Prime Minister, Daud had supported militias in the Durand Line. This had prompted Pakistan to close its borders. Fearing a war, the king dismissed Daud as Prime Minister in 1963. Prince Daud now took revenge. Unfortunately, President Daud was a dictator and did not believe in collective decision-making for the country's future. The president favored his own privileged class. Social and economic inequalities remained. This led to the growth of Socialist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. When President Daud began imprisoning some of its members, they staged a coup which overthrew and assassinated Daud Khan and his adherents. Soviet hand was hinted, but President Jimmy Carter's Secretary of State Cyrus Vance later wrote in his memoir, "We had no evidence of any Soviet complicity in the coup." New York Times and Wall Street Journal correspondents in Kabul reported that most Afghans supported the new PTPA government, which began land reforms that infuriated the landed class. Seeing growing Soviet influence in the Afghan government and among ordinary people, the US decided to overthrow the PDPA government. President Eisenhower had approved a similar plot to overthrow Iran's first democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953. This project was kept secret from both the House of Congress and the American people. According to Bob Woodward of Washington Post, a $70 million was used as bribes to depose the Afghan socialist government. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and democratic US's new friend, Communist China, joined the effort to spread Islamic fundamentalism in Soviet Central Asia and dismember the Soviet Union. The Mujahideen comprised unemployed youth and warlords who controlled the heroin trade and despoiled rural women. They were trained in camps in Pakistan run by Pakistani ISI, the CIA, and British MI6. One of the leaders was a Saudi engineer, Osama bin Laden, and a powerful Saudi politician, Jamal Khashoggi. In August 1979, the American embassy in Kabul bluntly declared that the United States' larger interest would be served by the demise of PDPA government, despite whatever setbacks this might mean for future social, and economic reforms in Afghanistan. The tragedy for Afghanistan gained momentum. The Soviet leaders admonished and advised the PDPA government to govern justly, to include peasants and workers in their team, to implement land reforms. The PDPA was not blameless. They resorted to reprisals against both educated dissenters and illiterate rebels, which led to more violence. Soviet Union sent more advisors but refused to intervene. Two incidents prompted Soviet Union to its ill-starred decision to intervene in Afghanistan. One was the murder of some 200 Soviet advisors at Herat, instigated by Iranian mullahs in late 1979. The second was when Hafizullah Amin began negotiating with the US to keep him in power in return for US military bases on the Afghan-Soviet border. Brzezinski, US's security advisor, publicly declared that he had instructed Pakistan and Saudi Arabia for a joint and coordinated response. Thus, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and ISIL were born. Faced with the grim prospect of destabilization of Soviet Central Asian republics and of nuclear arsenals there falling into the hands of Mujahideen, the Soviet army moved into Afghanistan on 26 December 1979. The National Army of Afghanistan joined forces with the Soviet army to halt the violence created by the mullahs, warlords, and Mujahideen armed with Stinger missiles. Money made the Afghan rebels pawns in a tragic game. The Mujahideen destroyed their country's infrastructure. They mined the land, blew up power transmission lines, oil pipelines, radio stations, government offices, hotels, cinema houses, and even hospitals. They killed indiscriminately passengers in airplanes and buses, doctors, teachers, students, and government officials. The Afghan Taliban became enemies of the Afghan people. The Soviet and Afghan armies tried to bring a semblance of stability to the strife-torn land. The Soviet army, which had defeated the formidable German enemy at Stalingrad, was defeated by the guerrilla warfare of the well-armed Mujahideen. Deaths and casualties on both sides were heavy. In 1989, a war-weary Soviet Union signed the terms of withdrawal through the Geneva Accord. The PDPA government continued under President Najibullah, who brought some stability to Afghanistan, but the newly formed Pakistani-backed Taliban, comprising Hekmatyar and Rabbani, assassinated him in September 1996. Freed now from all restraints, the Taliban brought a reign of terror to Afghanistan. They hated infidels, but they hated their secular compatriots even more. Kabul alone saw the massacre of 25,000 of its citizens, and it was perhaps the darkest era in Afghanistan, but worse was to follow. The attack on the Twin Tower brought the US to Afghanistan in September 2001 in search of Osama bin Laden, who was hiding in Pakistan. As US military planes began dropping bombs over this luckless land, convoys bringing food from Pakistan stopped. This drought was severe that year. 20,000 people died due to resultant famine. Hungry children were looking for food were blown up when cluster bombs exploded on them. The renowned Australian journalist John Pilger writes, "The invasion of Afghanistan was a fraud. In the wake of 9/11, the Taliban sought to distance themselves from Osama bin Laden. They were, in many respects, an American client with which the administration of Bill Clinton had done a series of secret deals to allow the building of a $3 billion natural gas pipeline by a U.S. oil company consortium. In high secrecy, Taliban leaders had been invited to the U.S. and entertained by the CEO of the Anocal Company in his Texas mansion and by the CIA at its headquarters in Virginia. One of the deal makers was Dick Cheney, later George W. Bush's vice president. John Pilger concludes, "When we watch the current scenes of panic at Kabul airport and listen to journalists and generals in distant TV studios bewailing the withdrawal of our protection, isn't it time to heed the truth of the past so that all this suffering never happens again?" The US imposed Afghan Jehad on Pakistan and Afghanistan through its intelligence wing, the Central Investigation Agency, during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. This was disclosed as the US National Security Archive declassified after 42 years, a trove of some 2,500 top-secret memos and documents from the US President Jimmy Carter's administration about US foreign policy. Among the documents and communications declassified is a memo titled Secret/Sensitive, wherein a finding under the U.S. Foreign Assistance Act of 1961 is cited for operations in foreign countries other than for purposes of intelligence collection. The document, signed by former President Jimmy Carter, authorizes the provision of legal military equipment either directly or through third countries to the Afghan opponents of the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. Provides selective training conducted outside of Afghanistan in the use of such equipment either directly or via third country intermediaries, it added. The document was shared on Saturday by Senator Moshahid Hussain Saeed, who noted that this significant decision by President Carter laid the basis for the CIA-funded Afghan war in 1979 through Pakistan. The war saw US inject $2.1 billion, which Saudi Arabia equally matched to fund the war. In minutes of a special coordination committee meeting on the issues of Iran and Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Carter's national security advisor, Brzezinski, at one point remarks, "We must make this costly for the Soviets very quickly. Within 3 days, we will see growing criticism of the US for doing nothing and being afraid to act." The committee was debated also using the Afghan situation as a bargaining chip with Iran on the embassy hostage situation. The archive said that unlike other messages routinely sent to the US president, these memos were not subject to institutional filters, such as the Secretariats of the State Department and National Security Council, and were intended for the president's eyes only. The disclosures also include minutes from a National Security Council meeting on the issues of Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel and the complexities involved.